Viking sexuality wasn't just the stereotype of brutal raiders taking what they wanted by force. It was actually a complex web of sacred rituals, gender fluidity, and magical practices that would shock modern audiences. Popular understanding portrays Vikings as hypermasculine warriors who pillaged and raped their way across medieval Europe. They supposedly followed rigid gender roles, where men fought and women stayed home. But behind that surface understanding was something far more intricate and sexually revolutionary. This was a society where powerful women practiced sexual magic with horse phalluses. The most revered god cross-dressed and bore children. Men who practiced certain forms of magic were called magical wombs. While modern society debates gender identity and sexual freedom, the Vikings were already exploring these concepts over 1,000 years ago. They merged sexuality with spirituality in ways that defy contemporary imagination. In this video, we'll explore 5 shocking aspects of Viking sexual culture, and the final revelation will surprise you. The first bizarre practice that defined Viking sexuality was the sacred worship of horse phalluses in fertility rituals. These ceremonies scandalized even medieval Christian chroniclers. The most detailed account comes from a story called Volsa That. It was preserved in the Flatey-Jarbok manuscript from the 14th century but describes events from 1029. At that time, Scandinavia remained largely pagan. This tale reveals how an isolated farming family turned a severed horse penis into the centerpiece of their evening religious ceremonies. Modern historians now recognize this as evidence of an ancient fertility cult that operated throughout Scandinavia. The story begins when a slave slaughtered a horse and prepared to discard the animal's genitals. But the farmer's son seized the organ and brought it to where his mother, sister, and female slaves were working. He made crude jokes about the appendage's potential sexual uses. This caused the slave woman to laugh while his sister recoiled in disgust. Then the family matriarch stepped forward and declared this magnificent specimen too valuable to waste. The mother was described as a skilled songwoman. She carefully preserved the horse phallus by wrapping it in linen cloth, along with onions and herbs to prevent decomposition. Then she stored it in a wooden chest where it underwent a supernatural transformation. Through what the Christian narrator attributes to demonic power, the preserved organ grew larger. It gained the ability to stand upright when summoned. The object became something the family venerated and named Volsi, meaning rod or phallus. Every evening, the entire household participated in a ritual. The father first took the phallus from its container. He recited verses over it while handling the object. Then he passed it to his wife, who performed similar incantations before handing it to the next person in descending social order. Each family member and servant was required to compose and recite their own verse while holding the sacred phallus. This created an elaborate ceremony that combined sexual symbolism with religious worship. When the preserved organ reached the slave woman during the ceremony, she would recite verses expressing her desire to lie with such a powerful specimen. Other participants made increasingly explicit comments about the phallus's size, strength, and sexual capabilities. The ritual concluded each night with all participants chanting, "May Mornir receive this offering." They invoked a mysterious deity whose name appears nowhere else in Norse literature, but clearly presided over fertility and sexual matters. This practice continued for months, until Christian king Olaf Haraldsson arrived at the farm disguised as a traveller. He witnessed the ceremony and destroyed the sacred phallus while converting the family to Christianity. Nearly 100 stone phalluses discovered across Norway confirm that such fertility cults weren't isolated incidents. They represented widespread Viking Age practices. These monuments served as focal points for sacrificial rituals, where people offered animals and goods to ensure successful crops, healthy livestock, and human reproduction. The detailed preservation of this account in medieval manuscripts suggests that such fertility rituals were common enough. Christian authorities felt compelled to document and condemn them. This provides modern historians with invaluable insights into pre-Christian Viking sexuality that merged the sacred and profane in ways that shocked their contemporaries and continue to challenge modern assumptions about medieval sexual practices. The second shocking aspect of Viking sexual culture involved the practice of pseudo-magic. Male practitioners were literally called magical wombs and engaged in rituals so sexually transgressive that they challenged the very foundations of masculine identity. Cider represented the most powerful form of Norse magic. It was concerned with seeing and shaping fate through techniques that involved ritual staffs, trance states, and practices that explicitly connected magical power with feminine sexuality and reproductive imagery. Male practitioners faced social stigma so severe that practicing this art was considered the ultimate form of unmanliness, or urgy. The term urgy carried profound sexual implications in Viking society. It described not just effeminacy, but specifically referred to men who adopted passive sexual roles or engaged in practices associated with female sexuality. For a Viking man to be called arga or accused of urgy was among the deadliest insults possible. It legally justified violence and social ostracism because it implied that the accused had surrendered his masculine independence. Such a man could no longer be trusted as a warrior, leader, or reliable member of society. Yet cider magic was so powerful and valuable that some men willingly accepted this social stigma to master its secrets. This led to the creation of specific terms like seidbrenda, which literally translates as magical womb. The most famous male Sidra practitioner was Odin himself, the king of the gods. He learned this magic from the goddess Freya despite knowing it would subject him to accusations of unmanliness. The Ynglinga saga explicitly states that Sidra was attended by such great urgi that men considered it shameful to practice. This explains why this sorcery was primarily taught to priestesses rather than male religious leaders. When Loki accused Odin of practicing cider in the poem Lokasenna, calling it an unmanly art, he was highlighting something significant. Even the most powerful male figure in Norse mythology could not escape the sexual stigma attached to this form of magic. Modern analysis of cider implements shows that these magical staffs were often ornately decorated and carefully crafted objects. They held central importance in Viking Age religious practices. The staffs were found primarily in female graves, but occasionally appeared with male remains in contexts that suggest the deceased practiced this controversial form of magic. The connection between cider and sexuality appears in multiple sources. This includes references to practitioners using their magical abilities to influence love, desire, and reproductive success. The trance states required for effective cider work were achieved through techniques that may have included controlled breathing, rhythmic movements, and possibly even drug-induced altered consciousness. Some historians argue that the sexual taboos surrounding male cider practitioners reflected deeper cultural anxieties about gender roles and masculine identity. Others suggest that these restrictions actually created space for individuals who didn't conform to traditional gender expectations. They could find accepted roles within Viking society as magical specialists who existed outside normal social categories. The term magical womb suggests that male practitioners were understood to have somehow acquired feminine reproductive capabilities through their magical practices. This fundamentally transformed their gender identity in ways that both fascinated and terrified their contemporaries. The third bizarre element of Viking sexuality was their acceptance of same-sex relationships provided they maintained specific power dynamics. These relationships preserved masculine honor while allowing for intimate bonds between warriors and even ritualized homosexual acts in religious contexts. Viking attitudes toward homosexuality differed dramatically from both modern perspectives and later Christian prohibitions. They focused not on the gender of sexual partners, but on the roles individuals played during intimate encounters and how these reflected their social status and masculine reputation. The crucial distinction in Viking sexual ethics was between active and passive roles. Being the dominant partner in a homosexual encounter carried no social stigma while being penetrated, was considered deeply shameful, and potentially grounds for violence or legal action. This perspective reflected broader Viking values that prioritized masculine independence and dominance. They viewed any man who submitted sexually to another as likely to submit in other areas of life and therefore unreliable as a warrior or leader. The laws of both Iceland and Norway specifically prohibited calling a man Argur, Strothin, or sans or thin. These were considered killing words that justified deadly retaliation. Despite these strict social codes, literary evidence suggests that homosexual relationships existed throughout Viking society. This was particularly true among warriors who formed intense emotional and possibly sexual bonds during their raids and campaigns. The sagas contain numerous examples of male relationships that appear to have romantic and sexual dimensions. They also describe ritualized insults between enemies that involve explicit accusations of homosexual activity used as weapons to destroy reputations and justify violence. Some of the most comprehensive insults recorded in Viking literature involve elaborate accusations of gender switching, sexual submission, and magical transformation. The acceptance of homosexual activity, provided it maintained proper power dynamics, extended to religious contexts. Certain male priests associated with the Vanir gods, particularly Freyr and Njörður, apparently engaged in practices that other sources describe as effeminate or sexually unconventional. The Christian chronicler Saxo Grammaticus scornfully reported that some priests of Freyr used effeminate gestures and the clapping of the mimes on stage, along with unmanly clatter of bells. Scholarly analysis suggests these religious figures may have dressed as women or adopted feminine hairstyles as part of their sacred duties. Golden foil plaques called gullgubba appear to depict same-sex couples embracing. Some show two bearded figures, and others depict two women with typical feminine dress and hair. These possibly represent homosexual relationships or religious ceremonies that honored such bonds within sacred contexts rather than condemning them as later Christian authorities would demand. These artifacts suggest that Viking society had more nuanced approaches to same-sex relationships than simple prohibition or acceptance. They created spaces where such bonds could exist within carefully defined social and religious frameworks. The fourth shocking aspect of Viking sexual culture was their widespread practice of polygamy and concubinage. This created such intense competition for women that it directly motivated the Viking raids as unmarried men sought wealth and captives to secure their own relationships. Recent anthropological research has revealed how Viking marriage practices created what historians call a male-biased operational sex ratio. Powerful men monopolized multiple wives and concubines. This left large numbers of lower-status men unable to find partners, and therefore motivated to engage in dangerous raiding expeditions to acquire the resources necessary for marriage. This system wasn't accidental but represented a deliberate social structure. Successful warriors and wealthy landowners maintained households filled with both legal wives and informal concubines. This created complex domestic arrangements that would be considered scandalous by modern monogamous standards. The distinction between wives and concubines in Viking society was crucial, but often blurred in practice. Legal wives held formal status and authority over household affairs, while concubines, called frilla, lived in the same homes as secondary partners who could bear children and advance socially through their relationships with powerful men. Wealthy Viking men often maintained what resembled harems. Multiple women lived in specialized quarters called kvenahus, or women's rooms where men could not enter without facing accusations of unmanliness unless they were particularly mighty heroes. The isolation of women in these domestic spaces created opportunities for lesbian relationships to develop. Anthropological studies of similar polygamous societies show that when multiple women share a single male partner and have limited access to outside sexual outlets, they frequently form intimate bonds with each other to meet both emotional and physical needs. The economic and social pressures created by this system drove Viking expansion across Europe. Chroniclers noted that young men who couldn't afford to marry within Scandinavia would join raiding parties specifically to capture women and wealth that would make them eligible for marriage upon their return. The practice became so widespread that medieval sources describe Viking raiders specifically targeting areas where they could seize young women to bring back as wives or concubines. They also accumulated the silver, goods, and land necessary to support multiple partners. Legal codes from both Iceland and Norway demonstrate how this system was formalized. They contained specific terms for men who avoided marriage, called fúðflógi, one who flees the female sex organ, and women who shunned marriage termed flanfluga. she who flees the male sex. Organ. This indicated that social pressure to participate in these arrangements was intense. The competition for women, created by polygamous practices, led to elaborate systems of bride price payments, dowry negotiations, and family alliances. These turned marriage into complex political and economic transactions, rather than simple romantic partnerships. The fifth and most disturbing aspect of Viking sexual culture involved ritual rape and sexual humiliation of defeated enemies as integral parts of warfare and masculine identity. These practices were so systematic that they were encoded in legal terminology and celebrated in literature as legitimate expressions of victory and dominance. The concept of sexual violence against conquered foes was so embedded in Viking culture that they developed specific legal terms like klamhog or shamestroke to describe anal rape inflicted on defeated combatants. They ranked this assault alongside castration as a major wound that caused the same legal penalties as injuries penetrating the brain, abdomen, or bone marrow. This classification reveals how Vikings understood rape not merely as sexual violence, but as a fundamental attack on masculine identity. It literally unmanned the victim and demonstrated the absolute dominance of the victor. The Sturlunga saga contains explicit descriptions of planned sexual assaults against both male and female captives. This includes an account where Guðmundur captures a man and his wife and announces his intention to have the woman raped by a criminal while forcing the husband to submit to sexual assault that would constitute ultimate humiliation and social destruction. These weren't spontaneous acts of battlefield violence, but calculated strategies designed to psychologically destroy enemies. They forced enemies into sexually passive roles that would forever mark them as unmanly and unworthy of respect within Viking society. The systematic nature of these practices appears in legal codes that specifically address the shame and social consequences of being sexually violated. Saga literature celebrates warriors who inflicted such humiliation on their foes as demonstrations of complete victory. The integration of sexual violence into Viking warfare extended beyond individual acts to encompass entire cultural practices around masculinity, honor, and social hierarchy. This made rape both a weapon of war and a tool of social control. Captive women taken during raids were routinely forced into sexual relationships with their captors. Captive men faced the choice between death and sexual submission that would allow them to survive, but only as permanently degraded members of society. The legal concept of being sansorðin, or demonstrably sexually used by another man, carried such severe social consequences that it justified violent retaliation. It also created a permanent class of sexually dishonored individuals who could never regain full social standing. The psychological impact of these practices extended far beyond their immediate victims to shape broader social attitudes about sexuality, power, and gender roles throughout Viking society. The threat of sexual violence served to enforce masculine hierarchies and social discipline even in peacetime. The celebration of sexual conquest in Viking literature demonstrates how these practices were understood not as shameful crimes, but as legitimate expressions of masculine power and social dominance. Successful warriors were expected to demonstrate their superiority through sexual as well as military conquest. Viking sexual practices didn't happen by accident, but occurred because specific historical factors created a society where sexuality, violence, and spiritual power intersected in ways that reflected their warrior culture's deepest values and beliefs. The situation wasn't simply barbaric brutality as later Christian chroniclers portrayed, but rather a sophisticated system of sexual behaviors that served multiple social, religious, and political functions within their cultural framework. The deeper historical significance lies in understanding how these practices reflected Viking attempts to navigate questions of gender, power, and identity that continue to challenge human societies. This reveals that our modern assumptions about sexuality and gender roles are neither universal nor inevitable, but represent specific cultural choices shaped by particular historical circumstances. The bizarre sexual practices of the Vikings may not align with modern expectations, but they were historically logical outcomes by the standards of that era, where religious beliefs, social hierarchies, and survival necessities shaped intimate behaviors. The lasting impact was the creation of cultural patterns that influenced Scandinavian society for centuries, while providing modern historians with invaluable insights into how human sexuality adapts to different social and environmental pressures.